All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Good afternoon to you guys. Hope you're all doing really well. It's Critical Thinking, Orange Coast College. This is Thursday, April the 9th, and I'm going live here doing our live stream for our 12:45 to 2:10 p.m. crew. So sorry I got it started just right here close to the hour. I was dealing with a couple of student emails from the previous group, but here we are. Welcome back, everybody. I'll give you guys just a few minutes to show up, and then we'll get through our lecture material for today. Today, the goal is to go over a new category of fallacies. They're called fallacies of unwarranted assumption, and I'll just kind of guide you guys through the notes on these examples. Also, just a couple of general class announcements and things to get clear about. So welcome everybody. It's 12:45 now. Hi Andrew. Anybody else that's here, feel free to chime in, drop a comment, say hello or anything else. As usual, ask questions if there's ever anything you want me to go back over and repeat or to clarify. The goal for this last few meetings over the past 3 class sessions. Hey, Amber, Andy, Phi, everybody else. Okay, no, not to worry. I guess you weren't late after all. Hopefully you got a good result. We'll find out. But anyways, welcome back, everybody. It's Fallacy Week. It's been fallacies for about 3 class periods. Today's the last day that we're going to spend going over more fallacies. And then Tuesday, next class, it's the quiz that has to do with all of them. So the quiz is just on Chapter 5. It's going to basically contain examples of fallacies, and what you got to basically do is tell me which fallacy is shown in each of the different examples. So, cool, good to know. Good, thank you, Dana. Donna, sorry. Anyways, yes, back to the Chapter 5. Everybody, today your homework number 2 was due. So for sure, if you didn't send it to me, make sure to get it to me. I'm looking at the timestamps for your deliveries. So Dana, I feel like I got it wrong before and I just keep getting it wrong. But anyway, thanks, Dana. Hey, Alondra and Wesley and everybody else. Yeah, so the homework, don't forget to submit it to me. Most of you probably already have, but if you haven't, just send it to my email. Here's something else I want to make very clear to everybody, because I've had a couple of issues with some failed delivery of the midterm exam from last week. Most people did not have that problem. I've already talked to the few individual cases where there were issues, but when you send me back the quiz form or a midterm form with the answers filled out, you cannot just hit reply to the Canvas announcement, because that does not send it through to the professor. You have to create a new email. And then you have to type in my email address, which you all know, which is on the syllabus, rvulich at occ.cccd.edu. If you just hit reply, it doesn't go to anybody because the Canvas course-wide announcements are sent to the whole class, and it's not a thread between you and the professor there. So most people knew that. Most people sent it in the proper way, but I've had a couple of issues with a few students that, you know, they didn't get to send it to me, and now I have to ask them to resend it with timestamps and everything to verify the original delivery time. But let's try and make sure that never happens ever again on Tuesday and on the final, and whenever other times I'm giving you guys as quizzes and things. Just, you know, you can either send it through Canvas as a new like message in the inbox or to my email, but do not just hit reply to the course-wide announcement. That doesn't send to anybody. Okay, so I'm already done with your midterms, and I've said to people that if you want your score, just send me a message and give me within 24 hours to reply back to you, and I'll let you know your score, and I can show you the written comments on your individual exam. So I'm doing it on a one-by-one basis. So when you want your score, ask. I've been replying to a lot of the students, and if you've already sent me a request, just know that you will get your answer back within 24 hours of the time you sent the message. So that's what I'm committed to doing for you. And then I'm also going to send around the answer key for homework 2. I'm going to do that. I'm going to wait about a day or so, because I don't know if there will be a few late deliveries. If there are, I don't want them to obviously know the answers before. So just to give people that might be struggling to get it in on time another day or so, I'll send the answer key this weekend, maybe tomorrow, maybe Saturday. Then you can use that to calculate the score you got on this homework that you just turned in. And so you'll be fully informed of all of your previous scores heading into the quiz for Tuesday. The Tuesday quiz next week, it's on fallacies, it's on chapter 5. So it's not a day where we have a lecture meeting. It's just, to take the quiz and to submit your responses before class time ends. So that's one thing that we'll do next week on Tuesday, what is that day? 14th? Yes, the 14th. Okay, so back to fallacies again. What we've done so far is we've gone over 2 different categories of fallacies. Hi, Cynthia, and hi to everybody there. The first category were fallacies of ambiguity, and in that group there was equivocation, where a word has different meanings and it's used in both ways, amphiboly, which is about grammatical ambiguity, accent, where the use of an emphasis on certain words changes the intended meaning of a statement. Then there was division, where a person assumes that each part of a whole must have the feature that the whole thing does. And then composition, where a person assumes that if a part of a group has a feature, then the whole thing does too. Okay, then last lecture, it was the fallacies of relevance, and those were the ones used in the homework you just now turned in. In fallacies of relevance, we talked about, let's see, first of all, personal attack ad hominem. That's when you attack a person instead of giving a counter argument to what they've argued, either in terms of attacking their character or circumstances. So there's the abusive and the circumstantial version of ad hominem. Then there's the appeal to force, sometimes called scare tactic. That's where to get a person to agree with you or to support your viewpoint, you basically use some type of either real or implied threat of force to try and win the argument or to get their agreement. Then there's appeal to pity. That's when you use an emotional appeal to try and get some special favor or consideration from a person, but in a situation where the use of pity is not relevant to the circumstances at hand. And then there's popular appeal. That would be where you refer to popular opinion in order to justify an argument or claim. Then there's appeal to ignorance. That's the one which claims that something is true just because it hasn't been proven to be false. So instead of actually having evidence for something, just claiming that no one has contrary evidence, but that's not really proof of something. And then there's hasty generalization. This is me just reviewing from last lecture, just for everyone's benefit. Hasty generalization is the one which jumps too quickly to a general claim from a sample that's either too small or unrepresentative. Like, for example, maybe, I don't know, somebody read in the news about a pit bull attacking a toddler or killing it, and then they say, wow, these pit bulls are just brutal, dangerous animals, and they're just judging that based on maybe this one case. Maybe that would be too hasty to generalize to all cases from that one conspicuous example. I don't know. Then there's straw man. That's when you misrepresent or distort your opponent's actual argument in order to make it seem worse and easier to criticize. Like if a person just said, I don't know, I think that we should cut back on pollution, and then someone says, oh, so what, you want to have no energy in this world? I mean, then how could we live? But there's a difference between saying I want to cut back and saying I don't think we should have any energy production. Then there's red herring. Red herring is when you try to distract from the main topic of the argument and go off on some kind of other tangent to change tracks. So like if a person said, we got to deal with global warming, and someone else says, well, no, not really. I mean, because have you really looked at this pandemic virus? That's the bigger problem. Well, there's 2 different problems, and they can be dealt with individually, but you can't change topics in an effort to discount the first person's claim. Okay, so with the review there, we're going to move on, and we have a 3rd category of fallacies for today's meeting. So there were 5 of the ambiguity fallacies, 8 of the relevance fallacies. And now today there's going to be 7 of what they're called fallacies of unwarranted assumptions. So that total amounts to 20. So the category name is fallacies of relevance. Okay, and there are 7 of them, but first thing I want to do is tell you what the definition overall of the concept of a fallacy of relevance is. Sorry, I'm writing the wrong word. I'm writing the wrong word. I knew it would happen eventually. Please forgive me, may you. I meant to write fallacies of unwarranted assumption. I spent so much time reviewing the fallacies of relevance just there that my brain was still on that word. But let's be clear. Today's topic are fallacies of unwarranted assumption. Okay, so just making sure we haven't forgotten what I've said. There were fallacies of ambiguity, 5 of them. Fallacies of relevance, 8 of those. Now, fallacies of unwarranted assumption, and there are 7 of these. So the definition overall is this is the type of fallacy that happens when an argument includes an assumption that is not supported by evidence. So when an argument contains or includes an assumption that is not supported by evidence. Okay, assumption, but it's not supported by evidence. That's when it has this type of fallacy there, that fallacy of unwarranted assumption. So just a note about the term warrant. To be warranted is to be justified. So it's just a synonym for the concept of justification, which we've talked about. Justification is just having reasons or evidence to believe something. So what these fallacies are fallacies of unwarranted assumption, meaning unjustified assumptions are in the argument. So with these different fallacies that we're going to learn today, they basically involve having claims within them that are not justified. They're just being assumed, but there's no reason given why the assumptions should be made. All right, so that's the notion of a fallacy of unwarranted assumption. Yes, it is those fallacies with assumptions that are not based on good evidence or supported by good evidence. There's 7 of them, okay? So I'm going to erase this general definition of the category, and then we're going to meet the members of this clan. There's 7, okay? All right, so I'm just going to first list them, and when I list them, I'm going to just write the names. Then after I do that, I'll go back through the list and start giving definitions and examples, starting at the top. But anyway, we have to begin begging the question, then inappropriate appeal to authority, okay. Third, loaded question. Okay, and the next one is called false dilemma. Next up, questionable cause. And slippery slope. And there's just one more after that. So we're getting a little low here, so I'm going to put it over in this part. The last one of the 7 is called the naturalistic fallacy. Okay, so this is the goal today. Our mission is basically to learn these 7 concepts and to be able to clearly enough understand them so that if we saw an example of one, we could pick it out by name and we could say, oh, okay, that's the loaded question, or that's a slippery slope right there, okay? So it's a straightforward project to refer to these 7 concepts, give clear examples, and then to make sure that that's something that I can add to your knowledge, right? So I'm going to start with the top, obviously, and we'll go over all of them before we're done, but we're going to go one by one. So I'm going to erase the others, start with begging the question. I just wanted to list them one time so that that's kind of in your notes. Now, to begging the question. Okay, so begging the question fallacy. This fallacy happens when one of the premises of the argument is just a reworded version of the conclusion itself. And therefore the argument kind of goes in a circle. So definition here. When one of the premises of the argument is a reworded version of the conclusion. Okay, so you got to have, with this fallacy, one of the premises is like just the same thing as the conclusion, but in different words. And that's a problem, because when you have a good solid argument, any argument is trying to prove a claim. The conclusion of the argument is what you're trying to prove. And as we know, the premises of the argument are supposed to be the reasons that back up the conclusion. But it's not a valid argument. It is a circular argument. It's a fallacious argument if the premise is just the same thing as the conclusion. In that case, what supports the conclusion is the same claim itself. But something cannot be evidence for itself. Like if you went into a court of law and they say, this guy's guilty, and you're the juror and you're like, okay, well, what's the reason that he's guilty? And they say, he's guilty because he's guilty. You'd say to yourself, hopefully you'd say, that's the bad argument. I mean, don't you need to give a reason, though? You can't just say he is because he is because he is. That's just repeating the conclusion. Now, let me give you some examples. Here's one that's mentioned in our book. So say we're looking at this argument here. Just one premise, and then the conclusion that's below it. So let the conclusion of the argument be that capital punishment is wrong. So that's the claim that this argument is trying to justify with reason. What's the conclusion? That the capital punishment is wrong. So if that's the conclusion, the question has to be given, well, why? What is the reason that it is said that capital punishment is wrong? Suppose that someone gives this as the premise. Why is it wrong? Because it is immoral for the state to use death as a penalty. Okay, so look at the argument then. What it says, if you can read it, is that it's immoral for the state to use death as a penalty, so therefore capital punishment is wrong. But let's try and think about what is written up here. What is a synonymous, different way of referring to capital punishment? What is capital punishment, really, if you know? Little kid comes up to you, says, hey, somebody said the word capital punishment in school. What does that mean? Now, you're the adult. What are you telling this kid? What is capital punishment? In other words, it's punishment by death. It is the death penalty. That's true. Okay, so it's just kind of like a formal term for death penalty. Now, what the conclusion it says is that capital punishment is something that's wrong. But what's the reason that's given? Because it's immoral to use death as a penalty by the state? Well, what is another way of saying that something's wrong? What is that? If something's wrong, you could also say it or phrase it as what? It's wrong to do something, or you could also just say it's immoral to do that thing. Good. So what the argument is saying here is capital punishment is wrong because capital punishment is wrong. I mean, it looks like it's a different statement, but it has the exact same meaning. So basically, this is a bad argument because it begs the question. It doesn't give any independent reasons to conclude that capital punishment is wrong. Now, that's not to say there cannot be good arguments that capital punishment is wrong. There are many people, reasonable people, that think capital punishment is wrong. But when you have a good argument that it's wrong, you have to give reasons that don't just amount to the same claim itself. Like you could say, I don't know, to empower the state with the ability to execute its citizens gives them too much control over our civil liberties, and the misapplication of justice is something that couldn't be revoked when death was the punishment. Therefore, death penalty is wrong. But those are reasons that don't just say it's wrong because, yeah, it's wrong. You have to give different reasons. You can't just make the reason the claim itself. Otherwise, there's no actual evidence. It's just the conclusion being supported by itself, and that's a circular argument. Sometimes this is also called the fallacy of circular argument. If you want to know a different name of begging the question, sometimes it's called circular argumentation. And that's because of this. The conclusion is supposed to be supported by the premise. But in this case, the premise is the conclusion, in other words. So the argument kind of goes in a circle. Why is the conclusion true? Because it's true. And we don't ever get outside of that little logical circle to get independent grounds for the conclusion. So that could be one example of this. Let me give you a few more so that we're all really well versed on this. How about, I'll give another one. Someone says, conclusion of the argument, abortion is wrong. And then let's say, well, okay, that's what you're arguing, abortion's wrong. What's the reasons then? What's the reasons you think it's wrong or that you get that conclusion? And somebody puts this on the table. Well, because it is unjust to terminate a pregnancy. Okay, well, once again, following this example through, what could be another, perhaps more detailed way of saying what is abortion? I hope all know what abortion is, but one way you could put it is that when one gets an abortion, what are they really doing, in other words? Let's see what you can say. The act of abortion is to terminate one's pregnancy, to end the pregnancy intentionally. What is it to say that something's wrong? Well, another synonym for being wrong is to say something's unjust. So in this case, the argument is it's wrong to get an abortion, therefore abortion's wrong. But this again is a circular argument. It begs the question. The term begging the question, the question remains why? Why though? So there could, again, don't misunderstand me, there could and there are actually solid arguments that some people have that abortion is wrong. There are arguments on both sides that are reasonable. Some people are pro-life, some are pro-choice. If you're pro-life and you think abortion's wrong, one of the best arguments is something that, like, the fetus has the potential to have a future like ours, and anything that has that kind of potential should have the ability to realize that potential. So therefore, abortion is wrong. But this doesn't just simply repeat the conclusion. It gives independent reasons. It says there's something about the qualitative nature of the human future that should be preserved, and thus, when one terminates that, they're doing something wrong. But this is a different case from the argument that you see here on the board. Just saying it's wrong because it's wrong is a bad argument. Now, maybe one last, and then I can close this little book on begging the question, and we'll go to the next example. This is one from the book, so I thought, let's use the text a little. It might be a little bit trickier at first, but we'll try to spot the circularity in this one. So take this one to have two premises. And the conclusion is that God exists. Okay, so God exists is the conclusion. And obviously many people believe in God, but maybe sometimes someone is asked, why is that what you believe? What's the reasons, or can you give an argument? Suppose someone gave this argument. Okay, so first premise, God wrote the Bible. And the second premise, the Bible says God exists. And so therefore, God exists. Now, looking at the argument here, let's see if you can make a judgment. Out of those two premises, number 1 and 2, which one of them is already assuming the conclusion is true before we even get to the conclusion? One of those two premises basically requires that the conclusion is true. Which one? Let's see. Claim of the argument, the conclusion of the argument is God exists. Good, Andy, it's 1. No, Andrew, it's not number 2. And Amber, no, it's not number 2. Number 2 just says that the Bible claims God exists. The Bible could claim God exists without God actually existing. But the first premise says what? That who wrote the Bible? God. But in order to write anything, a being has to what? Exist. A thing that doesn't exist can't write anything or do anything, because it has to exist to obviously write a Bible or anything else. So the first premise, which says God wrote the Bible, already holds the assumption that the conclusion is true. So basically, this argument amounts to saying that God exists when he wrote the Bible, and therefore God exists. But the claim that God exists is built into one premise. So it's a circular argument yet again. Now, could there or are there arguments for God's existence that are, good, valid arguments? Yes, of course. In fact, I have to teach a lot of those arguments in Intro to Philosophy and all kinds of classes every semester. They're famous arguments. One, for example, is called the Cosmological Argument. It says that everything has a cause, something that caused it to exist. Like you have parents, so the universe exists, therefore it has to have a cause. But whatever caused it can't have a cause of its own, otherwise it would go on to infinity. So there has to be a first initial cause, and that's God. Now that's an argument right there, but it doesn't make the assumption of God's existence until we get to the conclusion. So anyway, whether it's this example or the others mentioned, arguments should not beg the question. So it can be frustrating when people make this argument because it's hard to disprove the conclusion if you accept the premise. If you do think an argument holds this fallacy, then simply consider whether or not the conclusion can be seen in any of the premises, depending on the wording of the premises. Do they just imply or otherwise assert the truth of the conclusion? Okay, so next up, with that one now been stated, we're going to move to number 2, and that's inappropriate appeal to authority. Okay, so next, inappropriate appeal to authority. Okay, appeal to authority, inappropriate appeal to authority fallacy. So this here is a fallacy which happens when you appeal to an authority in order to support your argument, but the problem is that this person who you're appealing to is not actually an authority or an expert on that topic. Okay, so support your argument, but this person is not an authority or expert on that topic. Okay, when you appeal to some perceived authority figure or their testimony in order to support your argument, but this person is not actually an authority, not an expert on that topic. So, like for example, say that you went to the dentist and the dentist was telling you what you should do with your stock investments, and then you come forward with this claim to other people later. My dentist said that I should sell all my stocks, so therefore I ought to do so. I ought to get rid of all of my investments. What's the problem here? Well, the dentist may have his opinion and he's entitled to that, but the problem is he's not an expert in the range of investing and finance. If this was a stockbroker or an investment manager that gave you the same advice, then that's the proper authority to cite in getting to that conclusion. But a dentist is an expert in a different area, obviously, the world of dentistry, teeth, and everything pertaining to that. So they're outside of their area of expertise when they're being cited as the authority to rely on in the conversation about finance. That would be maybe one example. Here's one from the book. So it says, my priest says that genetic engineering is not safe, and therefore all experimentation in the field should be stopped. Well, okay. The thing about the priest case, though, is that a priest is not a scientist or a geneticist. Therefore, their opinion is not necessarily coming from a place of deep expertise. A priest does have some expertise, though, in matters of theology. They know all about the scripture, the history of the church. They can probably tell you all sort of things about chapter and verse of the Bible and the scriptural interpretation of that, etc. But unless they have some type of scientific background or expertise, they're unqualified to speak on the topic that they're being used as an authority for in this example. Sometimes we see this in advertising and marketing materials. Like a famous celebrity will endorse a product or service, but this person who's the celebrity has no expertise or knowledge on the subject. Like if you see Michael Phelps and he's doing a commercial for, I don't know, like some computer app or whatever. This is a person who's an expert swimmer, decorated Olympian. And if they had views about how to swim properly or how to train for that, you'd probably take their advice and it'd be good. But on this other issue of technology and mobile apps, maybe you'd rather listen to somebody who's got actual expertise on that. Another thing about the inappropriate appeal to authority is that it's often seen when you are dealing with people who have distinguished titles. Like in my own case, I have the title doctor because of my PhD in philosophy, right? The research-based doctorate. But just because I'm an expert in philosophy doesn't mean I'm an expert in everything. So like if, for example, you said, Dr. Vulich told me that helium is the heaviest element in the periodic table, and he's a doctor, so obviously that's true, you'd be making a mistake because, at least with me, chemistry was my worst subject ever in high school. I really struggled with that. But look, I'm a professor of philosophy, so I have expertise in a lot of the knowledge when it comes to logic, the history of ideas, Western tradition of arguments going back thousands of years. I'm pretty skilled about that. But when we're talking chemistry, I'm out of my area of expertise. So just because a person's an expert in one field doesn't mean they're an expert in everything. And sometimes people make that mistake because they just look at the name, doctor, professor, lieutenant, president, officer, or whatever. So it's okay to appeal to a person that actually has real expertise on a subject, but when you refer to a false authority, then that's a fallacy, as we see here. So does that make sense? That's an appropriate appeal to authority. Hopefully you guys get the gist. If you're speaking to a person that's got either no knowledge on that or they do have knowledge, but it's in a different realm, then they're not the one to use in an effort to boost your conclusion or to support your claims. Okay. And sometimes I've heard, little kids do this a lot because they'll just talk about, well, my dad or my mom said blah, blah, blah. My teacher said such and such, but my parents said no, that's false. Well, the teacher that's teaching, by definition, has knowledge and expertise on the subject that they teach, at least. If it's a parent that's basically uninformed on an issue, then although the child has a better relationship with the parent, that doesn't mean that this parent is smarter or more expert on every given topic. Okay. So moving on from inappropriate appeal to authority, we got more. So the next one is loaded question. Okay, so loaded question, fallacy. Okay, loaded question is basically when there's questions that are being asked, but they are assuming too much. So they're basically like presumptuous questions, leading questions, questions which assume an answer to a different question that was never asked. So let me put the definition here. When you ask a question that assumes an answer to a different unasked question. So you ask a question, but it assumes an answer to a different question that you never asked. So when these loaded questions are given, they basically try to put you on the spot sort of by making an assumption that's not known to the question asker. Like, so say for example, I ask you something simple like this: where do you work? How could that be a loaded question? It has what built-in assumption that maybe I don't know. If I ask a simple question to a person, where do you work? This is perhaps a loaded question unless I know them well enough, because I'm assuming what with that question? That the person has a job at all, especially now with the whole corona thing. That could be, you might not be able to give a straight answer. If a person says, where do you work, and you're not employed right now, then you can't just say, oh, I work at X, Y, and Z. You have to instead correct the questioner, like, nah, that's a loaded question actually. I don't even have a job right now, but you're assuming I do by asking which one is it. Okay, good, Andrew and Andy. Lots of questions exist just like that. Somebody says to you, who are you dating? Who are you with right now in a relationship? If you're single, that's a loaded question, and they're making the assessment or assumption that you have a partner, and it's just a question of who. In a relationship, sometimes you've ever heard this question: what's wrong? I don't know. Could that be a loaded question? Maybe, because what's being assumed there? What is being assumed with a simple question? What's wrong? Easy enough that there's something wrong, and the question is just, what thing is it? But obviously, it's possible for there to be no problem at all. And in a case like that, you can't give a straight answer. You can't say, well, let me tell you what's wrong. You have to say instead, no, there's nothing wrong at all. Your question is a loaded question, assuming there's a problem, but I don't see anything wrong. Let's see other examples here from the book. Sometimes when people make questions assuming things about you that they don't know. Let's see. What political party are you registered with? Maybe you're not registered with any political party or not even registered to vote. But they assume by means of the question that there's one party that you're a part of, and it's just which one. Sometimes in a court of law, these type of questions could be used as leading questions to try and get you to confess to something that maybe you claim innocence on. So the officer is asking you, where's the drugs? And you don't have any drugs. So it's like a leading question, trying to get you to say some location. Or the lawyer says to you, look, we got you on the witness stand. We just want to ask you, and just tell us right now, why did you do it? Why did you commit the crime? Now, you pled not guilty, but the lawyer is asking you, tell us why. The assumption of the question there is that you did do it, and we just need to know about the motive. But if you didn't do it, or if you're denying having done it, then this is a loaded question yet again. Here's a really kind of cringy, embarrassing one that I saw happen one time in life. I remembered it when I have to teach this. So in the workplace, there was a woman and a coworker, a guy, and he didn't really know her too well. But he saw her and he thought, hey, when is the baby due? Right? Because he thought she's pregnant. But this woman was not pregnant. So it was kind of a little bit of a body shaming incident, if you will. And in that case, again, you can't give an answer about due date or delivery date if you're not pregnant at all. So that was certainly a loaded assumption built into that question. Yeah, sad to say. But anyway, one in the book says, do you think that the death penalty should be used only for people that are over 18? What's the loaded question assumption there? Do you think it should only be for those that are above 18 or what? The question there is assuming what about the individual? Question again is, do you think death penalty should only be reserved for people that are legal adults? This could be a loaded question if what? We don't know what. If the person believes that the death penalty should ever be used, right, Andy? So if you're an opponent of death penalty and you find it wrong, then you don't think it's just a question of when the application of the penalty should kick in, but it shouldn't be done at all. Okay, so yeah, sometimes when people ask you certain questions like that, you have to redirect them to the right kind of question. You have to say, well, it's a loaded question, and you're making an assumption about me that you don't really know. Maybe if a person says, when's the last time you were hungover, or when's the last time you cheated on an exam or something? I mean, maybe you had done those things, but if you never did, then you can't give an answer about when because it's not happened at all. Okay, so loaded question. Hopefully we're all clear. So I'll move on, and we're going to go to the next. All right, just a couple more. Next up, it's what we call false dilemma. False dilemma. Okay. So this is sometimes called the fallacy of false choice, or false dichotomy, but our text uses the term false dilemma. So this is when you reduce the responses to a complex issue to an oversimplified either or choice. So you bring down something that's got way more possible responses than two, and you narrow it down to just seeming as though there's only two. So that's the idea here. It's when one reduces the responses to a complex issue to a binary either or choice. So it's like being presented with only two options, pretty much, but there are more than two options in reality. Okay? So let's see. What if somebody asks you, are you Republican or Democrat? How's that a false dilemma? It ignores that there's what? False dilemma. What do you, well, you write the word or. What do you mean? There are other political affiliations. This is what I'm fishing around for. Obviously, there are many more possibilities. There's Decline to State, there's American Independent, there's Green Party. Me, for example, I'm not registered with any political party. So if a person said to me, are you Republican or Democrat? I would have to say, this is a false choice. I'm neither one. I'm Declined to State. So anyway, you understand, in that case, there's a plurality of possible responses, but there's only two options given to the person to choose from. How about this? Somebody's thinking, I wonder what this individual thinks about me. I'm really worried about it. Do they love me or do they hate me? It's got to be one of those two. Do they love me or do they hate me? Well, how could that be a false dilemma in the way the person's thinking about the issue? It seems like they've got these two options, but what's possible? Well, it is too simple of a choice. Yes, too simple of a question. I mean, could a person neither love nor hate an individual? Sure. I mean, because love and hate are passionate, right? Just say, I don't care. I mean, you're fine, but I don't really have powerful feelings of interest or disinterest or like or dislike. So, that would be another case of a false dilemma. It happens in life when people get sort of caught up into the thought process that there's only two possibilities. So like kind of all or nothing type of thinking. Does everybody like me or does everybody hate me? Well, probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. You've got some people that feel just no particular type of way and they're not affiliated with either extreme response. Let's see some other cases here. The classic example of love it or leave it, that's a false dilemma too. Someone says, what's your attitude when it comes to the country? Do you love it or you just want to leave it? Which type of person are you? What are other options besides loving it or leaving it? I'd love to see if you have a view on that. What could be something besides loving it or leaving it? That's neither one. What do you think? Loving certain aspects, dealing with others, maybe. I mean, you could also just be a sort of person that's like, I don't love it, but I'm not leaving either. I was born here, so it's inconvenient to leave. How about I just stay and complain and raise my issues? Because after all, you live in a democratic society. You don't live under a totalitarian dictatorship where you're expected to salute, the leadership, and if you don't, you could be jailed or imprisoned or, confiscated, whatever. In a free, open society which has a constitutional framework, you're entitled to not love it and stay right there and keep making your criticisms to try and make it better over time. So, the love it or leave it argument is definitely another false choice, false dilemma. Maybe somebody thinks I have either got total control over my life or everything's completely out of control. Usually there's some happy medium between those. You can control some things you can't, but it's neither completely within your control nor totally outside of it. Okay, also about the false dilemma. Sometimes we see this in the results of surveys and polls. So sometimes a poll can be a bad poll if it doesn't give the proper range of options to the response, to the respondent. Like in the textbook, it mentions this. Suppose that the survey asks the audience, do you think that the criminal justice system deals too harshly or not harshly enough with criminals? That's only two choices. And when only those two choices were given, 6% said too harsh, 78% said not harsh enough. But when a third alternative was given, don't have enough information to say, 29% chose that response. So if you just looked at the first survey, you would think that the opinions of people are way more polarized than in the second survey, where the only difference is that an intermediate option was given. So sometimes polls themselves may not be that informative if you look at the way the questions are asked to the people who have to respond, and they're not given an honest range of responses that gives the actual ability to respond accurately to it. Okay, so that is a false dilemma. Basically, avoid being manipulated by the false dilemma fallacy. A lot of times people will ask you questions or make statements that try to put you on the spot, like which one is it, this or that? There's only these two cases. But if you ever suspect that this is being narrowed down a little bit artificially, then the best thing for you to do is say, I believe that's a false dilemma, actually. You know, there's more than just two. Why aren't you thinking about, you know, all these other possibilities that fall somewhere intermediate between those? Okay, so watch out for those either or questions that try to put you on the spot. If neither alternative is satisfactory, you might want to tell the person, I think that this is a false dilemma. Okay, good. So then let's move on to the next. So what we have next is what's called questionable cause fallacy. Questionable cause. So it's called questionable cause because it's the fallacy that happens when you assume without very good evidence that one thing is the cause of another thing. Okay, so it's a false assessment of cause and effect. When we assume without good evidence that one thing is the cause of another. That's questionable cause. Okay, so this fallacy happens when one person says that this is the cause of something else, but there's really no logical connection between the two things, and it's not the cause. Sometimes people commit this fallacy when they think in terms of like superstition. Like one thing happens first, and then another thing happens after that in time later. And just because the first thing was first, they randomly assume that it was the cause of the second thing. Kind of like good luck rituals could be a case. So like, Andy, I'll give you an example like that. Bad luck, too. Let's start with the bad luck. You're walking down the street, black cat crosses your path, and you're a really superstitious type. So you're like, you get the chills. You're like, ooh, black cat, that wasn't good. Then let's say later on that same afternoon, you get into a little fender bender with your car and some damage on your car, which is a big hassle and it costs you money and you're upset. So now what's the false questionable cause fallacy here? The person would say, I knew it. Once the cat crossed my path, something would happen and it caused that car accident. But it's not the cause. The cause of a car accident has to do with the roadway conditions, the drivers involved, but there's no possible way that a cat in a completely different part of space and time could somehow mysteriously be the reason that this accident occurred. Good luck could work the same way. You wear your lucky socks, you go to school scared because you're not prepared for the test, but the professor randomly canceled class that day and it gets postponed. You're like, yes, I'm so happy. I wasn't ready. Now I get more time to study. Lucky socks kicked in and helped. But of course, it's not related to the socks. The professor has no knowledge of who's wearing socks or whatever, and it can't possibly factor into their circumstances, which led them to not be able to hold the class. So there are causes and effects in reality, of course, but they have to have like logical association between each other. There has to be some reason or evidence to suggest that this would reliably recur under the same kind of conditions. And there's no way to induce reliable occurrence of good or bad outcomes by wearing such socks or such cats crossing your path. Or if a mirror breaks and then, something bad happens, or you step on a crack and your mom gets into, she slips and hurts her back later on in the week. There's no way of thinking, at least not rationally, that those things cause the others. Now, in Latin, there's another name for this. I don't want to insist on it because it's kind of old school, but it's post hoc, meaning after the fact. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is the full name. So something comes later, and therefore it's assumed to be the cause of what came before. But just because something happens first doesn't mean it caused what happened later. I mean, look, for example, I don't know, our semester started way back in January, and then the coronavirus took over and the whole country shut down. Is it because we took critical thinking? If you didn't enroll in this class, maybe that never would have happened. Well, obviously, there's no link whatsoever between the two things. So when you make a real claim that A is the cause of B, there has to be some kind of reliable and independent evidence to suggest that A is the cause of B. If you've got no good evidence or reasons, and it's just a superstition or just literally the fact that one thing is first in the order of time, then that's a questionable cause fallacy. Here's another example from the book. I found this to be kind of interesting, right? So you probably have heard of Jennifer Lopez. This is a famous, singer and actress. She just did a Super Bowl performance at halftime. It seems like a long time ago now, but anyway. So her mom, Guadalupe Lopez, she won $2 million on a slot machine in Atlantic City, and hit the jackpot, which is crazy, right? Because they're already really rich and totally financially secure. But anyway, she was gambling out there, and she won $2 million on the slots. Now, right before she pulled the lever, she had this little good luck saying, like a little incantation or phrase. And she said that little good luck charm, and then she actually won. And so in her mind, that's the reason she won. She's like, I knew that charm would come in, and it did cause me to win. But obviously, that's not the cause. Because if it was, then you could reliably induce winning by saying such phrases. And people would learn that, and then after time, the house would always lose, the casinos would go out of business, because people would basically be able to rig it by simply saying their favorite phrase and reliably and systematically winning. But that's certainly not how it works. So anyway, all around, those are all examples of questionable cause fallacy. One last one just for fun, okay? You guys probably have heard of Babe Ruth, the famous Hall of Famer from baseball, right? In 1920, he was traded by the Boston Red Sox to the New York Yankees, and I guess he wasn't happy about that. So what he said at the time was, I'm putting a curse on the Boston Red Sox. No, forget those guys. Like, I'm cursing them. It's the Babe Ruth curse. Okay, so what happened next was like 80 years passed, and they never won a World Series. Finally, in 2004, they actually did win it. But during that whole span of 80 years, people kept talking about Babe Ruth's curse. It's once again causing the Red Sox to never get to the World Series or never win it. Obviously, a person long ago dead, having just said something aside, can't be a causal connection between the results of sporting events. Otherwise, me and you could just curse any team right now, and then they would stop being able to win. But it's not that way. Okay, questionable cause. Good. Hopefully it's coming clear. So we just have a few more then, and we'll wrap up when we're done with those. All right, so next is what's called slippery slope. Okay. Okay, slippery slope fallacy. It's the unjustified idea that if we allow or take a certain type of action, then eventually all actions of this type will be permitted or taken. Okay, so the unjustified idea that if a certain action is taken or permitted, that eventually all actions of this type will be taken or permitted. Okay, so there's our definition of slippery slope. It is, again, when a person assumes that if one type of action is allowed to be taken or it's permitted, then down the line, eventually, all those type of actions are going to be taken or permitted. And usually the way slippery slope is going is that it's described as the subsequent actions that are allowed or taken based on the first get worse and worse and worse over time. So they're like increasingly negative as time passes. So let's think about some examples of this idea. One that's mentioned in the book is like the development of artificial intelligence in AI labs. So think about this. Why could a person, if they commit this fallacy, say, hey, back off, we got to stop with this artificial intelligence that we're working on in computer labs? Seems like it's innocent enough now. But if we keep doing it, eventually what might happen, so says the slippery slope. Start and allowing and taking the action of programming computers for artificial intelligence. Eventually, what's this going to lead to? What kind of dystopian outcome is the long-term result of this? Machines will take over. AI will take over. We'll be enslaved by robots. Is that really what you want? I don't think so. So therefore, don't even start down that path, because it's going to lead to a very dark result. But here's the thing. There's no really good reason to suppose that the development of artificial intelligence for the human purposes that we have is going to lead to some science fictional, robot apocalypse. So that would be maybe one slippery slope, and you hear arguments given like that. Some people said that, okay, under President Bill Clinton, there was this policy of don't ask, don't tell, which basically said that if you were gay and you're in the military, we're not going to ask you about it, but also we don't want you to tell us about it. So basically, you couldn't. Sarah Connor, good reference for the Terminator there. But the gays in the military thing, under don't ask, don't tell, the policy was don't say anything, we won't ask you either. But people couldn't be open about it, right? Now, years passed, and the Obama administration repealed the don't ask, don't tell policy. But when they did, there was a whole bunch of debate, and some people were saying we shouldn't repeal it, because if we do, what's going to happen down the line is it's going to eliminate the cohesion of the fighting forces. There's not going to be the same type of camaraderie and et cetera between the men and women that are out there fighting. Therefore, it's going to compromise the capacity of our fighting forces, and will eventually be overrun and invaded and overthrown. So let's not allow this to happen. But of course, the policy was rescinded, and none of those foretold, overhyped, cataclysmic, apocalyptic results have happened. In fact, I think there's evidence and there's studies on this that show that having more people willing to sign up, free of the fear of persecution or exclusion, actually enhances the strength of the fighting forces. But that was a slippery slope fallacy in that case. Some have talked about it in terms of, let's see, the gateway drug argument. Some people will say, don't take a sip of that alcohol. You think you're going to dabble in it, experiment in it, or whatever. And it might sound like a fun thing at the moment, but what it's going to lead to is a life of total addiction to every drug, and eventually you'll be this hopeless crackhead and you can't do anything with your life. I know you don't want that, right? So don't even try and experiment one time. Now, whether there are good or bad reasons for doing those substances, many people, of course, are able to have a phase, at least, where they tried to drink a few drinks or something along those lines and never became a totally hopeless addict. So that could be a slippery slope fallacy sometimes. Yeah, so always based prediction, or gay marriage, another one. Okay, so 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples are allowed to marry in all 50 states of the United States. But it was, a controversial decision, split decision in the court, but it came down that way. And there were some people that were arguing, well, okay, gay marriage, that sounds like a slippery slope. It's a step towards being able to marry anything and anyone. Maybe you can now just marry inanimate objects like your fridge or your toaster. Is that what we want? We want people to be able to marry their pets. But obviously, the policies have changed, and none of those, weird kind of things have occurred as a result of this. So when you hear overhyped and perhaps speculative projections of negative results that could follow from doing something, then that's a slippery slope fallacy. There's a kind of visual metaphor you're supposed to get when you hear the name slippery slope. You should be thinking of like a person standing atop a hill, and there is a slope that's steep, right? And it's slippery. So the thought is, it's like a metaphor, right? But don't take one step even. Don't even take one little tiny step in that direction, because if you do, it's not going to stop with one step. The slope is slippery, right? So you're going to slip on it, and then you're going to cascade down the hill, And as you go further and further down the hill, your injuries are just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. So don't even start with the one step. That's kind of the backstory of why it's called slippery slope. So anyway, when you make predictions of what's going to happen perhaps in the future, they got to be based on good, solid evidence, not just speculation or like overly dramatized skepticism or pessimism, right? Base predictions of future outcomes on the best available evidence and research, and just watch out for the tendency that some people have to exaggerate their predictions of what could happen in the future based on something. Some of you maybe ever heard the story as kids. I remember this book, a children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. Now, I don't remember, in a way now having to teach this, I wonder, was this a good lesson for the kids? It's almost teaching them to think in the slippery slope terms. But in the Give a Mouse a Cookie example, the story was, the cookie wants a mouse, but don't give it to him, because next time he's going to want 2 cookies. And the next time after that, he's going to want some milk. And then after that, he's going to want a little more space in the house to enjoy his cookies and milk. Then he's going to want to have a whole floor. Pretty soon, you got to move out of the house and stay in the garage, and the mouse owns everything. And it all started with that one decision to give him the cookie. I don't know. Are we teaching children that, don't be too generous to people because it's going to end up undermining your best interests? I don't know if this is a great lesson, but whatever. It kind of fits the bill of the example that we're talking about here. And sometimes you see parents talking this way too. Don't spoil your kid. If you let him get that candy bar just because he's asking for it now, then when he's like 20, 30, 40 years old later in life, he won't be able to delay any gratification, and he won't be able to stick with school, or he won't be able to stick with a relationship because he's just always wanting stuff. But it's probably not true that the casual decision on a given day is going to put him on that path. So slippery slope. Okay, so we get into the next and the last one then, and that is the naturalistic fallacy. So that's it here. Okay, so naturalistic fallacy, one of the perhaps easier ones to think about, it just says this. It's the unjustified assumption that whatever is natural is good and whatever is unnatural is bad. Okay? The assumption that whatever's natural is a good thing, but whatever's unnatural is a bad thing. And that is just not necessarily true. Sometimes it is, but it's not true in every case. And you have to look at things on a case-by-case basis when it comes to whether they're good or bad, regardless of whether they came from nature or whether they're man-made or whatever, or artificial. So take for example, people that don't want vaccines. They say, vaccines don't come from nature. Our body would have fought off these viruses without the help of the vaccine, and therefore they got to be bad, right? They don't grow on trees, they don't come up out of the ground. But definitely vaccines, as we can see, prevent us from transmission of diseases and also inoculate us from getting them in the first place. So if we didn't have vaccines, we'd still be all walking around fighting off polio and all kinds of other opportunistic viruses from the past. So just because they don't come from nature doesn't mean they're going to do you harm. Or if you thought so, then what about every medicine? I mean, when you're taking Tylenol, when you go to the doctor and they perform a transplant on a person, I can't think of anything less natural in the world than having another person's organs inside of your body taking over for your organs that got removed. That's not what was supposed to happen in nature, but it's probably the only way you can survive in many cases. And it's an extraordinary intervention into nature, but that's what mankind is able to do. When you just you're looking at this computer right now. If you think that everything that comes from not nature is bad, then maybe we should put these computers away and get rid of them. Stop driving your cars, stop talking on your phones, don't use the television. Obviously, man-made intrusion into nature has, in fact, delivered a whole bunch of efficiency for the sake of our life form. You mentioned the case of the Amish, Andy. I don't know. Maybe they have certain religious basis for the belief that even very rudimentary forms of technology, like zippers and such, maybe even buttons, are wrong. But in general, there's not any scientific evidence or in general, no such evidence that these things are harmful to people. Maybe there's a broader religious rule that they think is inspired by an interpretation of scripture, but this is a different case. Should you rub poison ivy all over your body because it just comes right out of the ground? No. Some things that come from nature aren't good for you. Hurricanes, earthquakes, they come straight out of nature. They're not created by us, but they're definitely not helpful to anyone. The virus that we're all fighting off is something that's found in nature. It comes from nature, but we don't like that either. Let's say you had a terrible, debilitating illness like a cancer or whatever, and you wanted to take on a homeopathic course of treatment. No chemo, no radiation. Scientific evidence doesn't really show that that's going to necessarily be correlated with the better health outcomes. Definitely not. I mean, you might deny yourself the most aggressive treatment that provides your best chance of survival in those cases. So unless you want to really give back all your technology and reject it as something that is not good, and unless you want to affirm the value and goodness of things that come from nature that definitely don't have our best interests in mind, look, nature, in the state of nature, doesn't really care much about the state of human beings. If we were just living in the state of nature and we didn't have the ability to kind of dominate and control it in some ways within limits, then we would be much, much more, at a disadvantage. Our lifespans would be much shorter, and we wouldn't have all the trappings of modern life that make our lives better. Certain drugs, of course, they come from the ground. People could say, well, the coca leaf, that's just something that grows. God put it here, right? So isn't it a good thing? No, it's very addictive. It definitely has health harms and impacts. Marketers and advertisers will sometimes use this way of thinking to try and market and sell us their products. So even some things that are known to be dangerous, like say tobacco, you find some tobacco manufacturer putting labeling on the package that says organic tobacco, natural tobacco, naturally grown, full leaf, whatever, as though that changes its internal chemistry. It still has the same carcinogens and tar, but it's making it seem to the consumer like there's no harm in this case because it's more natural. And a lot of consumable products out there in the market are the same. You'll see it labeled non-GMO or grass-fed and all that stuff. Now there could be, to be fair, ecological sustainability reasons for favoring the more locally sourced or conventionally grown, not grown through mass production and pesticides. There could be ecological sustainability reasons for favoring that. But just in terms of its overall health impact on you, there's no evidence to suggest that like an organic tomato has more or less nutritive properties than one that's grown on a big factory farm. So those are naturalistic fallacy examples. We have to look at things on a case-by-case basis. Some things that come from nature, like the next pandemic, are not great. Some things that come from man, like the next vaccine, are fine things. And we can't just be overly broad and general in the way that we distinguish the two things, saying one is broadly brushed as good and the other bad. So that's everything I think I have for you guys, right, on the last group of fallacies here, the fallacies of unwarranted assumptions. So now we've learned all 20 from the book, from chapter 5. 5 fallacies of ambiguity, 8 of relevance, 7 of unwarranted assumption. The Tuesday meeting next week, our next class, it's not a lecture, it's not a live stream like this, it's another quiz. It's a quiz on chapter 5. I'll deliver it through Canvas, and you guys will send back your responses before the end of the class period. So since you're just taking your quiz, there's no lecture associated with Tuesday's meeting, the 14th. But we'll get back to our lectures on schedule next Thursday, and you follow the syllabus from there. Yeah, and just remember that when you submit that quiz, you have to make sure that I get the delivery. I will send a confirmation of receipt to each student that I do get their message from. So if give me a little time, maybe it could take a few hours. But if you find that I never said thank you for your submission, then that's something you can infer that there could have been a problem with delivery. In general, create a new email and type in my email address. Do not reply to the course-wide announcement that I'm going to send by Canvas, because some messages get lost that way. Okay, so if there's no questions, everybody, then I think we're good to go. I guess I'll just say have a great weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy. Hope you guys are doing well in your other classes and everything else in life. So it's good to see you again. Take care. And until next time, I will be in touch. Let me know about the quiz. All I was trying to say, Dana, is that you've got to send it as an email using my email address. If people just hit reply to the Canvas message, it doesn't come to the professor. A couple of people had that problem, and now I'm tracking down their midterms from last week. So yeah. Is there attendance? No, there's no attendance at all anymore. But I love seeing you guys here. Okay, guys, thanks a lot. Have a good day. Take care, okay? Bye-bye. When will the quiz be? The quiz is on Tuesday. The quiz is during class time Tuesday the 14th. It's in the syllabus, so you're going to get your quiz on Tuesday. It's on Chapter 5, so be ready. Okay, guys, thanks again. Take care. No other questions? Everyone's good? All right, then. Have a great one. I'll see you soon, okay? Bye-bye.